Okay, so it's really good to welcome you all once again. And this week we're looking at chapters 31 to 40. And this section I entitled Margery in Rome. Actually, if we added on one more chapter, 41, then we get it all the way through. I just missed off one, so apologies there, because actually when she leaves Rome and starts heading back home, that's chapter 41. But I want to look at this section. Actually, it does work quite well as a section in itself. So it's quite a good section for us to look at tonight. Now, Rome, if we just get our heads in context with what's going on in the medieval period at this time, Rome is the second most important site of pilgrimage at this time, the first, of course, being Jerusalem. Now, the reason it was so important was because of pilgrims going to visit the tombs of St. Peter and St. Paul. And there were also lots of other churches which had holy relics in it. So there was a bit of an itinerary that you could go around the different places, the holy sites of Rome. It was a really long and arduous journey for many people, and it's quite a dangerous journey to get to Rome at this time. So we know that Margery is coming from the Holy Land up through the coast and then coming down into Rome. Now, as I say, Rome was a really important site of pilgrimage. It was important for people right from the 2nd century onwards. But what really made it one of the second most important places of pilgrimage was, let me just let that person in, was because the Pope said that when it's a Jubilee year, which is every 7 years, when it's a Jubilee year, then there would be special penances and dispensation given. And so that meant that you would, so penances and all those merits of dispensation were something about that would happen in the afterlife. So if you went on a pilgrimage, then it meant that you would have less time in purgatory, or you could do it on behalf of somebody else. So it was really important for people's souls. So the sense of their salvation going forward, but also a sense of their souls at that moment in time, because they not only received dispensation in the future, but also received merit at that moment in time. So it's really, really important. And for the Pope to do this really gave a boost to pilgrimage at the Holy Land. And particularly, he made this link between visiting the tombs of St. Peter and St. Paul. Okay, so you would be forgiven a lot of your sins if you went to these two places. So it already, the pilgrimage to Rome already had benefits given to it. It was already seen as a journey of penance where you would receive forgiveness for sins. But what the Jubilee did was it actually heightened this. And so around a Jubilee year, you would find the whole city being flooded with pilgrims. So it's a really, really important place in the medieval world where people would have longed to go to, second after Jerusalem. So what do we have going on in this section? Well, it's very much like what Margery was describing in her pilgrimage to Jerusalem that we looked at last week. Is that she doesn't really tell us much about the sites. We don't actually have her going to the tomb of St. Peter and St. Paul. She doesn't tell us anything about that. Actually, she only mentions a few churches, and I can actually tell you what the churches are. So One of them is St. Marcellus, which is the church of San Marcello of Corsa, which was destroyed by fire in 1519. So that no longer exists. So she goes there. She goes right at the beginning to the hospital of St. Thomas of Canterbury. St. Thomas of Canterbury, where she actually goes on arrival when she gets to Rome. That's the place where she goes to. And that's because it was very much known as being a place for English pilgrims. And if you remember, she goes there right at the beginning, and she goes there pretty much later on towards the end when her reputation has flowered, and she's actually accepted into that hospital, whereas at the beginning she has a bit of a trouble there. The other one, actually, the hospital, the grounds where that hospital stood is still in used. It's used by the English College in Rome, and it actually occupies that site on the Via del Monserrato. And the St. Thomas's Hospice was founded in 1362. So it's actually quite late. It's quite a late one. So it's obviously shows that English pilgrims to Rome was increasing and they needed somewhere to stay. The other church she mentions is what is strangely called the Apostles' Church. And this is probably, unfortunately, it's probably not St. Peter and St. Paul, but it's probably the Church of Santi Apostoli, which she refers to in chapter 35. Then there's a really significant church she goes to, which is the Church of St. John Lateran, and she refers to that in chapter 33. And actually, the Church of St. Giovanni in Laterno was the cathedral church of the Diocese of Rome and the seat of the Pope. There is a very significant place to go for her. And then finally, she again refers to this strange sort of the stations of Rome. She doesn't specify what they are, but she just the stations in this kind of umbrella kind of way of talking about them. And she mentions that in chapter 39. And even then, she seems to mention it in passing. But alongside that, that was seen as very much the kind of pilgrim route around the various churches and the holy sites. Now, last week, we heard about exactly what that actually meant in Jerusalem, but she doesn't actually tell us what that meant in Rome. We can again piece it together from other bits and pieces of literature, but what's important is that Margery doesn't really tell us. She sort of skates over that. So if Margery is in Rome for any kind of pilgrimage at all, why is she there? I don't think it's probably just a stopping off on the way home. It's obvious that she's not there to really see the tombs of St. Peter and St. Paul, but it seems from what we've read this evening, what we've read in this section, is that she's actually there because of her icon, St. Bridget of Sweden. Now, with St. Bridget, when you look at her pilgrimage, when you look at Margery's pilgrimage to Rome from the viewpoint of St. Bridget, then suddenly it all seems to drop into place. And the most significant places she goes to are those connected with St. Bridget. For example, she goes to the church of St. John Lateran, which I've mentioned, but the reason she goes there is because it was one of the places that St. Bridget visited when she came to Italy. So it has a connection with that saint already. And I suspect that that is exactly why Margery went to that church. And this really becomes very obvious when we get to chapter 39, which is at the final sort of end of the section we're looking in, where Margery tells us a whole series of things that she has encounters that she has, which are all connected with St. Bridget. First of all, she meets one of St. Bridget's maidservants who tells her what St. Bridget was actually like. Can you believe it? You get to meet somebody who is connected with your icon. So she must have been very excited about that. And then she meets a person, a man, who says he knew Bridget. Now, I don't know if that's actually true, but it might be a little bit of like, oh, yeah, I know her. You know, that sort of, I know her 3 times removed. But obviously, Marjorie's going around and saying, oh, did you know Bridget? Did you know Bridget? Because this is the person who is most important to her in her absolute sort of understanding of her vocation. And then she gets to go to the room where St. Bridget died. And she tells us that she hears preaching and teaching in that room. But what's even more important is that Margery gets to kneel on the stone where the Lord appeared to St. Bridget. So she actually gets to stand on the spot. Now, isn't that remarkable? We have so many people who come to Canterbury Cathedral here. And obviously they say to us, so where did Becket die? Or they'll say, where is Becket's body? We have to say, well, it's not really here. But it's something about connecting place with a person. So connecting a stone or a building or a chapel or something that has a kind of longevity to it with the transience of a human life. And so we still have it today. So it would be easy to dismiss Margery's sort of enthusiasm about Bridget, but we still have it today, that desire to go to the spot where someone who we know about or who we admire or a story that actually touches us to actually say, this is where it happened. And finally, on one of St. Bridget's days, Margery tells us, is that she was in the chapel, which had previously been the room in which she died. And there we have this rather extraordinary description of how Margery not only senses it, but the whole world seems to have an atmospheric, storms and atmospheric forces. And so Margery is kind of, comparing her kind of experience at that time with a kind of a global one. So the Bridget and Bridget's sanctification is something which is really shown through the the forces of nature, through which God is showing that Bridget is a really important saint. The reason being is that at this time, if you read the notes at the back at all, is when Margery is in Rome, St. Bridget is in this in-between stage of, she's been announced as canonized in 1391, but that has not been ratified by the great council of the church. And it's not until 1415 the Council of Constance that actually her canonization is made, is ratified, and she is then placed within the calendar of saints as someone who is venerated and for whom you can actually worship and see the love of God in her life and through her life. So Margery is in a state where she really, this is her real icon, but she's also in this place where, Bridget isn't not quite there yet in her canonization. So in a sense, showing that the natural forces are revealing God's will that she should be fully canonized is a kind of reflection of that, an endorsement by Margery, an endorsement by God that she is more important than she has been viewed at that moment in time. So she means so much to Margery. Now, why? Why does she mean so much to Margery? So I want to just go into a little bit about who is Bridget of Sweden. It may be I don't know very much about Bridget, and I certainly haven't read her Revelations, which I probably should have. It'll be the next book on my reading list at home here. So Bridget was born in 1302, and she was actually born to quite a prosperous and quite an important family at that time. Her father was the governor of Uppland in Sweden. And it said in her in the book that starts to collate all her experiences that lead to her canonization, that she started having visions at the age of 12. So as was the custom at the time, she was given in marriage at a very young age to Ulf Gudmason, and with him she had 8 children. I think only 6 of them survived. And in 1341, she and her husband, they took a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. So they were traveling from north to south, all the way through Europe, and actually then were very aware of just how divided the church was at this time, because it was at this time, obviously, that there was a pope in Avignon. Sadly, her husband died in 1344 in a monastery. But this kind of began Bridget's second part of her life. So she returned to Sweden and she renounced all her possessions and began a life of penance and prayer in a monastic house. And it was here that she started to have her revelations, whose authority was witnessed by her confessors and by her spiritual directors. And she was very obedient to her confessors and spiritual directors. And that's quite an interesting thing to note if we remember in Margery just how much that obedience is needed in these sections that we've been thinking about. So during her revelations, Bridget was very much called to action for God, and she founded a religious order, the Bridgetines, which was specifically there to serve the poor. And also they were an interesting way of running a monastic order, because they had both men and women together, and they were under a single abbess. What's interesting, though, of course, is that Bridget herself remained a laywoman the whole of her life. So in 1349, Bridget left Sweden and she went to Rome, and there she became a Roman citizen, I guess, as we would say today. And the basis of Bridget's spiritual experience is what she calls mystical union. She describes herself as a bride of Christ, and She describes her revelations with kind of passionate words. And she talks about there being an ineffable sweetness between her and Christ, and that this union gave her. And her main desire was to, as it's reported of her, to love God with all her heart in denying herself and her own will. Now, this ardent fusion of her will with Christ's will is found a reward in the sense that she can sing of grace, the grace of mystical ecstasy. So it's very high fluted sort of language that she uses, but very intimate and personal with the person of Christ. Now, her mystical work is often called, and it's still referred today, as the Revelations. And it's really varied in form. It consists of this sort of mystical, dialogue and sweetness and experience of the being of Christ and union with Christ. But there's also loads of dialogue in it. So she dialogues with Christ, she dialogues with saints, she dialogues even with devils. So there's lots of kind of conversations going on. And just like anyone at this period, she has a deep devotion to the suffering of Christ on the cross. She has a passion for Mary as the mediator of prayer, and this acceptance of God's justice on earth. During her pilgrimage to Jerusalem, she fell ill and returned to Rome. And it was in Rome, of course, that she died on the 23rd of July, 1373. Now, of course, for someone like me, 1373 just springs out because, of course, that's the year that Julian of Norwich has her own revelations. And it's not, I think, we mustn't underestimate just how informative and how powerful, in a sense, Bridget's revelations were at this time. She really gives a voice for women visionaries. She gives a voice for women within the medieval church. And particularly what she does is that she brings and she marries up together the mystical experience of union with the domesticity of being married to Christ. So if you think about it, at this time, there wasn't much for women to do. You either got married or you became a nun. That was pretty much it. Or you might go and be an anchoress. So that was pretty much it. And either way, you were under the authority of somebody. You were either under the authority of your husband, and we've seen that very graphically shown in this text, where Margery has to do her conjugal rights to her husband, or you come under the authority of a priest, confessor, and also an order. So what Bridget does in this sort of a world is liberates women in that sense. They don't come under any authority except that of Christ. And you have to remember at this time that Bridget is not married now because her husband's died, and she's not a monastic. So she's an ordinary lay woman. So I think that at this time, this late medieval time, that it must have really enabled women to have an authority within the church that they hadn't really managed to have before. And it's through this this visionary outlet that they can have with Christ, and that Christ is not someone distant and remote, but actually is like their husband within their lives. Now, what I find really interesting is when you look at Bridget's life, and I've just, just sort of run through it very, very briefly there for you, just how much starts to resonate with the section that we have been looking at Margery in Rome. So first of all, we know that Margery's done a bit of her own pilgrimage of the sites of Bridget. But then we find that Margery is also identifying herself with the person of Bridget. If you think about it, so Margery was married, or is still married, in fact. Margery had lots of children. Margery is a lay woman. Margery has consecrated her life. Margery is obedient to her confessors. Margery also is this strange layperson who doesn't really have any authority over her apart from the person of Christ. So I'm not surprised, therefore, that slap bang in the middle of this section, we have a whole description of Margery's visions. What are they to do with? Spiritual marriage with Christ. So how much then is Margery actually saying, oh, I really like Bridget because actually I relate to Bridget. Bridget is someone who has the same kind of life as me, and actually I can relate my visions to Bridget's life. Now, how much, I mean, we could say the other way around, is how much is the life and experience of St. Bridget affecting Margery's visions? Now, is she having a vision, an understanding of a spiritual marriage with Christ, because that's what she actually experienced? Or is she having that because she knows that's what St. Bridget had? Now, I wouldn't want to separate the two, because, of course, we know that so much of how we understand these ineffable experiences are really shaped and formed by our own context, and also by our own personalities, and by our own sort of understanding of faith. But that just makes me wonder, the way that this section is structured is just how much is Margery going back and saying, oh, I understand that a lot better, because actually it was pretty similar to what Bridget was experiencing. I think what would be interesting would be to consider and think, and maybe you can do this in your groups, is, to what extent are Margery's experiences very different from Bridget? Now, I don't know enough about Bridget, I have to say, to be able to answer that very clearly. But there's one thing that seems to strike me when I read Margery, is that Margery's the domestication of Margery's vision seems quite clear. So when she has this spiritual marriage, she talks about Christ as, in a sense of, like a husband and wife, oh, come and climb into bed with me and I'll give you a cuddle. It's terribly ordinary, and it's terribly sweet in a way. She's not talking in these kind of highfalutin mystical union terms. She's talking about a very ordinary, everyday, easy relationship, like her husband has been replaced by the person of Christ. but in that same sort of easy, everyday, domestic way. So it seems to me that what Margery does is she really does bring that experience of her revelations right in to her ordinary, everyday world. It's something that Julian also does, brings the whole Passion of Christ right into Julian's experience of the world around her in Norwich. So I wouldn't be surprised if Margery and Julian both are rooting and grounding this understanding of union with Christ as something that's not special, that's not extraordinary, but it's something that's very much open and accessible then for everyone. So that's my little foray into Margery and St. Bridget of Sweden. So I'm going to before I turn off the recording, I'm just going to put up the questions so that you can see, but also so later anyone else. There we are. So there are the questions for this week. So if you want to, as I say every week, these are just pointers. If you want to talk about something else, then absolutely please do. Do not feel beholden at all to look at these. They're just icebreakers. That's probably the best way to put them.